The Callaway Creek lumber camp was no place for a woman alone, and everyone who saw Verna Ashford step off the supply wagon that October morning knew it. She carried one bag, worn leather, the strap mended twice with different thread. She set it down in the mud without looking at it, and she looked instead at the mill. The stacks of raw timber, the smell of pine sap sharp enough to sting, and she did not flinch. She had nowhere else to go. That was the whole of it. Her mother had died in August, 2 weeks after the harvest failed. The farm in Pemberton had gone to the bank before the ground froze. Verna had packed what she could carry, which was not much, and she had taken the stage east toward Callaway Creek because she had heard from a woman at the boarding house in Whistler that the Harding mill was looking for someone to manage the cookhouse accounts. She was 24 years old. She could read. She could write. She could do arithmetic faster than most men she'd ever met. She had references from the mercantile in Pemberton, where she'd kept the books for 3 years. She had 18 cents in her coat pocket and a pair of boots that let in water on the left side. She asked the first man she saw where she might find Mr. Harding. He looked at her the way men looked at things they didn't know what to do with. "Which one?" he said. "The one who runs the mill. That'd be Clem." He jerked his head toward a long wooden building at the far end of the yard. "He's in the counting house." The counting house smelled of sawdust and tobacco and old paper. A man stood at the back wall, with his shoulders to the door, studying something pinned there that Verna could not see. He was tall, broader than the doorframe had suggested, and his hair had gone to gray at the temples, in the way of men who'd worked outdoors their whole lives. He did not turn around when she came in. "Mr. Harding," she said. He turned then. His face was what she expected, weathered, angular, the skin around his eyes creased from years of squinting into sun and wind. He was somewhere past 40, she thought, though it was difficult to say. His expression told her nothing. "I'm Verna Ashford," she said. "I heard you were looking for someone to manage the cookhouse accounts." He looked at her for a long moment, not rudely. More the way you'd look at a map when you weren't sure you were reading it right. "Who told you that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "A woman in Whistler. I don't know her name. She heard it from the supply driver." "Harkins talks too much," Clem Harding said, which was not a denial. He pulled a chair out from the desk and sat down in it heavily. He didn't offer her the other chair. "What experience have you got?" she told him. 3 years at the Pemberton Mercantile, full ledger responsibility, supplier accounts, payroll for 6 staff. She recited it plainly, without embellishment, the way she would have read figures aloud. She watched him while she spoke. He was watching her back, and she could not tell from his face whether any of it was landing. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. He picked up a pencil from the desk and turned it in his fingers once. "The cookhouse accounts are a mess," he said finally. "Whoever had the job before walked off in July and took the last 3 months of receipts with him." "I can work with what's there," Verna said. "There's not much there. Then I'll start from what I can reconstruct." He looked at the pencil. He set it down. "The cook's name is Mrs. Oakes. She'll have the supply invoices going back to spring. Beyond that, you're building from nothing." He paused. "Pay is $14 a month. You'd sleep in the back room of the cookhouse, meals included." $14 was less than she'd made in Pemberton. "The back room of a cookhouse was not a bedroom," she said. "That's agreeable, because it was the only offer she had." He stood up. He was taller than she'd realized. "I'll take you over." He walked half a step ahead of her across the yard, not in a way that seemed deliberate, just in the way of a man who was used to walking alone. The mud had hardened overnight into ruts that caught her bad boot at an angle, and she nearly went down. She caught herself on a fence post and kept walking. He didn't look back. Mrs. Oakes was a broad woman in her 60s who moved around the cookhouse with the authority of someone who had never once been questioned in her own domain, and did not intend to start now. She looked at Verna with something that was not quite suspicion and not quite welcome. "The room's small," she said. "I don't need much room," Verna said. "There's a cot and a shelf, the window sticks." She handed Verna a key on a loop of twine. "Supper's at 6. If you want to eat before that, you eat what's left from the men's noon." What was left from the men's noon was generally the bread that had gone hard and whatever vegetables hadn't made it into the stew. Verna ate it standing at the kitchen counter the first evening, because there were no extra places set, and Mrs. Oakes was already scrubbing pots, and it didn't seem the moment to ask about a chair. She did not feel sorry for herself. She had known it would be like this. Starting somewhere always meant starting at the bottom of it, eating what was left, sleeping in the room no one else wanted. You proved yourself later. You proved yourself through the work. The accounts were worse than he'd said. She found the ledger books in a crate under the counting table. 4 of them, covering the last 2 years, and they were a record of someone who had understood accounting only just well enough to hide the fact that they didn't. Numbers transposed, columns that didn't balance, entries that appeared twice under different headings before. She had with them picture clear enough to say anything. The picture, when it came clear, made her go still. There were payments logged to suppliers she couldn't find any record of receiving goods from. Consistent payments every month for the better part of a year, not large individually, $5 here, $8 there. But they added up to something significant over time. She cross-referenced against the supply invoices Mrs. Oakes had kept in a biscuit tin under the counter. The invoices didn't match. She sat with that for a long time. She was new. She had been here 10 days. This was not her problem in any sense beyond the professional one, and the professional one was already difficult enough. She could note the discrepancy in her summary and leave it for Mr. Harding to decide what it meant. That was, strictly speaking, the job row. At the pattern of them. At the months in which they appeared, and the amounts by which they varied. There was a logic to the timing that told her it hadn't been careless. Someone had made a deliberate choice many times, over many months. Verna was the daughter of a woman who had once walked 12 miles to return $2. She'd been accidentally overpaid at the grain elevator. The family had not had $2 to spare that week. Her mother had walked 12 miles anyway. Some things, her mother had said, you don't have to think about, you just know. She began building the corrected ledger from scratch. She didn't tell Mr. Harding what she'd found. Not yet. She needed to be certain, and being certain meant reconstructing enough of the actual accounts to demonstrate the discrepancy with numbers that would hold up. She worked evenings after supper, after the kitchen quieted down, at the small table in her room by lamplight. Mrs. Oakes had stopped looking at her sideways by the second week. By the third, she sometimes left a plate covered on the back shelf of the counter without saying anything about it. Bread that wasn't hard, and a portion of whatever had been made for the noon meal, still warm. Verna ate it and didn't make a point of it. Some kindnesses you receive quietly. She had been at Callaway Creek for 5 weeks when Clem Harding came into the cookhouse. One morning before the crew arrived for breakfast and stood in the doorway of the small room where she was working and said, "How are the accounts coming?" "Better," she said. She looked up. He looked like he hadn't slept well, though she couldn't have said why she thought that. His face didn't give much away. "I need to talk to you about something when you have time." He came in then and sat down across the table from her, which she hadn't expected. He looked at the ledgers open in front of her. "Show me." he said. So she showed him. She had laid it out as clearly as she could. The original entries, the reconstructed accounts, the payments she couldn't reconcile, the pattern of them across 14 months. She walked him through it, the way she'd walked through the Pemberton ledgers with the mercantile owner when there was something to explain, methodically, without drama, letting the numbers say what they said. He didn't interrupt her. He sat very still, the way still men do when something lands hard, and she watched him absorb it. When she finished, the room was quiet, except for the sound of Mrs. Oakes doing something with a pot out in the kitchen. "How much?" he said. "In total? About $230 over 14 months. He was quiet again. His hands were flat on the table, and she noticed, not for the first time, how worn they were, the knuckles scarred, the kind of hands that had been in physical work since boyhood. He said finally, "The man who had the job before you. I can't say for certain from the records, but the timing fits." He nodded slowly. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "You've been here 5 weeks," he said. "Yes, you found this in 5 weeks. The pattern wasn't hard to see once. I had enough of the records reconstructed. It might have been found sooner if the accounts had been in better order." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" It was a fair question. She'd asked it of herself. "I wanted to be sure," she said. "I didn't want to bring you something I couldn't defend." He looked at her for a long moment. She met it. She had learned, growing up, that there were 2 kinds of looking, the kind that was trying to diminish you, and the kind that was trying to understand you. This was the second kind. "All right," he said, and pushed back from the table and stood up. He took the ledger she'd been building, the corrected one, and looked at it for a moment before setting it back down. "Keep going with this," he said. "I'll deal with the other matter." She nodded. He left. She sat for a moment after he'd gone, listening to the crew arriving outside, the sound of boots on frozen ground, voices in the cold air. Then she turned back to the work. November came in hard that year, the kind of cold that arrived 2 weeks before it was expected, and stayed past when it was welcome. The supply wagon from Whistler got stuck twice in the same week, and the mill ran short on the oil that kept the saw mechanisms from seizing. Clem Harding spent 2 days driving down to the valley himself and coming back with what they needed, and Verna watched from the counting house window as he came into the yard in the late afternoon light, looking like a man who had done a thing and was already thinking about the next thing. She had started attending the morning tallies, the brief accounting of the day's work that Clem held in the yard each morning before the crew went out. She had not been invited specifically. He had not told her not to come. She came because the tally figures affected the supply orders, and the supply orders affected the accounts, and the accounts were her responsibility. He hadn't said anything about it. After the 3rd morning, he had glanced at her as the crew dispersed and said, "You're going to freeze standing out there." "I have a coat," she'd said. He'd looked at the coat. It was her mother's, heavier than her own had been, and she was grateful for it. He'd looked at it the way he sometimes looked at things, not commenting, just noting. Then he'd gone back inside. But the next morning, there was a second mug of coffee on the counting house step when she arrived. She picked it up, and it was exactly the right temperature. And it was exactly the right temperature, which meant someone had timed it. She drank it and said nothing. The accounts by December were the best they'd been in 2 years. She knew this because she'd reconstructed enough of the prior years to compare. She had a system now. A running ledger that tracked the supplier accounts weekly, a monthly reconciliation that she cross-checked against Mrs. Oakes's records. A clear picture at any given moment of where the money was going and why. She had also found 2 other smaller irregularities that turned out not to be fraud, but simply error, and had corrected them, and had put a note in the ledger explaining what she'd changed and why, so that anyone who looked at it later would understand. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she liked the work. Not just liked, was good at it in a way that felt like using a tool that had been made for your hand. The logic of accounts, the way a clear set of numbers told the truth about a place and how it was being run. There was something satisfying about that, something that reminded her of her mother, who had always said that a clean set of books was a form of honesty. She was thinking about this, about her mother, and honesty, and books, one evening in December when Clem Harding knocked on the doorframe of the counting house. She looked up. He had his hat in his hands. He did that sometimes, she'd noticed, when he was being deliberate about something, held the hat rather than wearing it, the way other men might clear their throat. "The crew's Christmas dinner is Saturday," he said. "Mrs. Oakes does a roast. You should eat with us." She looked at him. He was looking at the doorframe, not at her, and the line of his jaw was set in the particular way she'd come to recognize as meaning he was saying something he'd thought about before saying. "I usually eat what's left," she said carefully. "I know what you usually do." He looked at her then. "I'm asking you to eat with us." She didn't say anything for a moment. The lamp on the table between them made the room feel smaller than it was. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Harding." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He left. Saturday's dinner was loud and warm, and smelled of roast pork and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of Mrs. Oakes's molasses bread. The crew were in good spirits, the way men got before a long holiday shutdown, the roughness of working life set aside for an evening. Someone had brought a fiddle. Verna sat at the end of the long table near Mrs. Oakes, and she ate a full plate of food at a table, for the first time since she'd arrived, and it tasted like something she hadn't known she was hungry for. Clem Harding sat at the head of the table. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, not intrusively, just as a fact of any room he was in. He didn't talk much, but he listened to everything, and twice she caught him looking down the length of the table in her direction, and both times he looked back at whatever was in front of him without expression. After dinner, when most of the crew had drifted outside into the cold with their pipes and their bottles, she stayed to help Mrs. Oakes clear up. It was not required of her. She did it because her mother had raised her to, and because she liked Mrs. Oakes, though she would not have said so directly. When they had finished and Mrs. Oakes had gone to bed and the cookhouse was quiet, she came out of the kitchen to find Clem Harding still sitting at the far end of the long table with a lamp turned low. She almost went back through the kitchen. Then she didn't. She sat down at the table, not near him and not far. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Outside, the fiddle had started up again somewhere across the yard, thin and bright in the cold air. "The accounts look good," he said after a while. "They are good," she said, not boasting, just fact. He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "You're not given to modest," she said. "I'm given to accuracy," she said. "They're different things." He was quiet. He turned his glass once. "I wrote to Harkins about what you found in the accounts." She waited. "He's not the supply driver anymore," Clem said. She nodded. That was what she'd expected, and also what she'd hoped for, and she was glad it had been handled without being made into something she'd had to be part of. "The $230, he said. "I don't expect to see it recovered." "No," she agreed. "You probably won't. The mill's in better shape than it was 6 months ago regardless. The accounts tell me that. They tell you correctly." He looked at her across the table. The lamp was low enough that she couldn't read his face clearly, but she had gotten better, over the weeks, at reading the absence of expression in it. The way stillness in him sometimes meant something was being turned over. You could have found work in a town, he said, with your experience, a bank or a trading company. Somewhere easier than this. I could have, she agreed. Why didn't you? She thought about how to answer that honestly. I needed to start somewhere, she said finally, and I didn't want to start somewhere easy. Easy is, she paused, looking for the right word. Easy lets you stay small. Doing the thing no one else wants to do is the fastest way to show what you're worth. He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that she thought he might not respond, which was all right. She hadn't said it to get a response. She'd said it because it was true. My wife, he said then, used to say something like that. She waited. She said the best way to find out if you could trust a person was to give them a difficult thing and see what they did with it. He turned the glass again. She died 4 years ago, fever, in the spring. I'm sorry, Verna said. The mill was struggling then. It's been struggling since. He looked at the table. I didn't see how bad the accounts had got. I was. He stopped. I wasn't looking at them the way I should have been. It was, she understood, about as much as he would ever say about the years after his wife's death. About what grief did to attention, to the ability to see what was right in front of you. She didn't push it. The accounts are in order now, she said. That's what matters. Because of you. Because of the work, she said. I did the work. The mill runs. The two things together are what put the accounts in order. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the fiddle had gone quiet. The yard was still. You're going to argue with me, he said, about whether you deserve credit. I'm going to give you accurate information, she said, about where the credit belongs, which includes you. You hired me. You trusted me to come in and find something that was difficult to find, and you didn't stand over my shoulder. That's not nothing. He was quiet. He picked up his glass, looked at it, set it down without drinking. My foreman tells me I should offer you a raise, he said. Your foreman is right, she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she didn't entirely know what to do with. It wasn't quite a smile, it was the precursor to one which was different. $18 a month, he said. 20, she said. A pause. 19. Done, she said. He extended his hand across the table. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he held it a beat longer than a handshake strictly required, and then he let go and stood up. Good night, Miss Ashford, he said. Good night, Mr. Harding, she said. He put on his coat and went out into the cold, and she sat for a moment in the quiet of the empty cookhouse, her hand still on the table where his had been, listening to the sound of his boots on the frozen ground growing fainter as he crossed the yard. January was deep cold, the kind that slowed everything. The mill ran shorter days. The crew stayed closer to the bunkhouse in the evenings, and the supply wagon from Whistler gave up entirely for 3 weeks when the pass filled with snow. Verna used the time to go further back in the accounts than she'd originally intended, reconstructing 3 years rather than 2, and what she found was a mill that had once been, plainly, doing very well. She brought the comparison to Clem on a Tuesday morning, unfolding it on the table in the counting house, showing him the trajectory, the high point 3 years ago, the slow decline, where the decline had started, what she thought had caused it. He stood across the table from her and looked at it in silence for a long time. And she was the one who kept the accounts, he said. Before. Verna didn't ask who. She knew. I didn't know what I was looking at after she was gone, he said. I thought I did. I didn't. The decline started before the accounts went wrong, Verna said carefully. You were making the same decisions. The fundamentals were sound. It was the financial management that failed, and that was a failure of oversight, which is easier to see in retrospect than at the time. He looked at her. Are you defending me?" "I'm being accurate," she said. There's a difference between a poor decision and a gap in attention during a difficult time. The evidence in the book supports the latter. He looked back at the papers. He was quiet for a long time. "What would you do," he said, "if you were running it?" She had thought about this. As it happened, she had thought about it the way she thought about most things, quietly, methodically in the evenings. She told him, 2 additional supplier contracts for the spring, a change in the billing cycle that would improve cash flow by 6 weeks, a different approach to the seasonal payroll that would reduce the crunch in the slow months. He listened without interrupting. He had the quality, she had noticed, of making you feel heard even when he said nothing. Something in the way he went still that was different from the stillness of someone who wasn't paying attention. When she finished, he said, "Do it." She blinked. "I'll need you to authorize the supplier contracts. You'll have the authorizations. Do the rest yourself." She looked at him. He was already moving toward the door, putting his coat on. "Mr. Harding," she said. He stopped. "That's a significant amount of authority to hand to someone you've known for 3 months. He looked back at her over his shoulder. 3 months is long enough, he said. "I know what I'm looking at." He went out. She stood at the table for a moment with her papers in front of her, and the lamp burning in the corner, and the sound of the mill starting up for the morning outside. Then she sat down and picked up her pencil and started on the supplier letters. Spring came late, and all at once, the way it did in that part of the country, a week of hard frost and then overnight. The snow ran off the roof in sheets, and the mud in the yard was 1/2 foot deep, and the creek at the edge of the property was running high and fast and copper-colored with snowmelt. The mill ran full days again. The supply wagon made it up from Whistler for the first time in weeks, and Harkins's replacement, a younger man named Wallace, who talked less and showed up when he said he would, became a regular and reliable presence. The accounts were excellent. She did not say this to Clem directly because he could see it himself, and men like him did not need to be told what they could read, but the evidence was there. The mill was running at a profit. For the first time in 3 years, the supplier contracts were settled. The cash flow was the smoothest it had been since his wife's time. One morning in April, she came into the counting house to find a chair at the table that had not been there before. A proper chair, not the stool she'd been using, wooden, with a straight back and arm rests, and a cushion on the seat that was clearly new. She stood in the doorway looking at it. She sat down in it. It was, she noted, exactly the right height for the table. She did not mention it to Clem. He did not mention it to her. But that afternoon, when she came out of the counting house to speak to the supply man about an invoice, she passed him in the yard, and he glanced at her with something that was. She had gotten better at reading his face by then, the same thing as a question. "The chair is very comfortable," she said, as she walked past. She didn't look back, but she heard him make the sound that was not quite a laugh. Sat counted it. He started, somewhere around that time, having his noon meal in the counting house rather than with the crew. He didn't announce this. It simply began to happen. She would be working at the table, and the door would open, and he would come in with 2 plates from the cookhouse, and set one in front of her, and sit down across the table with the other one. He would eat. She would eat. They would talk sometimes about the mill, or the accounts, or the spring runoff, and sometimes they wouldn't, and both kinds of noon were comfortable in the way that was only possible once 2 people had spent enough time in the same silence to stop being afraid of it. Mrs. Oakes had noticed. Mrs. Oakes noticed everything. She didn't say anything to Verna directly, but she had taken to including a decent portion in what she set aside for the counting house, and there was often something extra, a piece of pie, a second biscuit that appeared on one of the plates, without explanation. Verna ate the pie and did not make a point of it. Some things you receive quietly. It was on a Thursday in May that Clem Harding said, the thing that changed the shape of the rest of her life, though she didn't know that when he said it. They were eating noon in the counting house. She had been explaining the spring projections which she was pleased with, and he had been listening with the particular quality of attention she had come to rely on. When she finished, he looked at the papers in front of them for a moment, and then he said, without looking up, "I'd like you to stay." She waited, because the sentence seemed incomplete. He looked up then. "Not just through the season," he said, "permanently, as, whatever the right arrangement is, manager of accounts, a stake in the books properly." He stopped. He picked up his fork and put it down again. It was the first time she had ever seen him handle a silence badly. "I mean to do this properly," he said. I'm saying this badly." She watched him. This was a man who had spent 4 years finding ways to say nothing about the things that mattered to him. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said slowly. "Because the accounts need managing, or for another reason?" He looked at her directly. His face, which gave so little, gave something then. "Both," he said, "but the other reason more." She sat with that for a moment. Outside the window the creek was running, and somewhere across the yard the sound of the mill was steady and purposeful, the sound of a place that was working the way it was meant to work. "You should know," she said, "that I would have stayed for the accounts. I know that. But yes," she said, "for the other reason too." He breathed out slowly. He looked like a man who had been holding something for a long time and had just been told he could set it down. He picked up his fork again. They went back to eating. Later, she would think about that moment, the plainness of it, the way they had said what they meant without ornamentation, and then gone back to their meal, and how that was exactly right, for who they both were. There was no declaration. There was a question and an answer, and the understanding of two practical people that some things, once said, didn't need to be elaborated. She had come to Callaway Creek with 18 cents in one bag, and the knowledge that she was good at her work and that goodness at work was something. She had not come expecting anything beyond a room and the chance to prove herself. She had eaten what was left, and she had slept in the small room, and she had built the accounts from nothing. And at the end of it, the mill was running better than it had in years, and there was a chair in the counting house that fit her exactly. Some things you don't have to think about. You just know.